Good morning, welcome to Learning to Learn. And today we start with the first unit of our 11th standard English reader. I would like to repeat, a reader book for that matter, is a book where every literary genre has been put together on a particular theme. There is some kind of a common element that runs through and through all these literary genres. Now coming to our first unit of English reader of 11th standard, we have got three beautiful pieces that have been prescribed to you. One happens to be a prose piece by Kushwant Singh. It's an essay and it's titled The Portrait of a Lady. And you have a brilliant poem, and that poem talks about once upon a time. It's by Gabriel Okara. And more than that, you have got a very remarkable short story, and that is written by O. Henry, and it talks about two friends meeting after 20 long years. This is after 20 years. But today we start with the first part of your first unit, that is Kushwant Singh's remarkable article. It's not an article, it's an essay written about his grandmother. But before we launch into that, your textbook gives a kind of an assignment. It has given you two types of families that are prevalent everywhere. And one happens to be a nuclear family where the parents are there along with the children. You may have your sibling, your brother or a sister, elder to you or younger to you. So that is one kind of family setup. There is another one, and the book refers to that too as a joint family. But when you look into the dictionary, Oxford Dictionary, it makes use of this particular phrase, joint family, like a joint venture. It makes a specific mention in the Indian context, right? Joint family, that usage is not un-English, it has been accepted by the dictionary, but nonetheless, there is something more appropriate, and that happens to be an extended family, or as the dictionary says, the undivided family, specifically in Indian scenario, where apart from the father, mother and the children, you also have the grandparents, uncles and aunts, nephews and nieces and cousins, everyone, generations, all the generation living together in one particular building or under one particular roof. It's a very brilliant concept, though unfortunately we don't come upon that kind of an extended family very often everywhere. But before we'll get into the essay written by Kushwant Singh, you have to know something about the person. Kushwant Singh, an Indian writer who has also been a Padma Bhushan awardee, Padma Vibhushan awardee and a Sahitya Academy awardee. His writings in English are well known for their wit, their humor, their sarcasm and their satire upon certain habits and practices of the society. And many of the literary magazines in English in India have always found his writings, and the writings have, every now and then, they have been appreciated and applauded by the people because they are loaded with certain things which we so much wanted to tell others. We burst into laughter sometimes we just smile, sometimes we giggle, but nonetheless we always appreciate the wonderful way he could narrate certain things. This particular writing, that is The Portrait of a Lady, talks about his grandmother, and he starts in his own unique, typical way. He says, my grandmother was old like any other grandmother. Fine, you may have to turn around and see how old your grandmother is. My grandmother is old like any other grandmother, and she has always been old because I knew her for the past 20 years and she can never grow older than this. She can't, her being old cannot be improved. It doesn't diminish nor does it increase. Her old age remains static because her appearance is the same. And he also talks about the wrinkles on her face. He says it goes from everywhere to everywhere. But before we proceed on with this description, the beautiful description, I would like to ask you to make use of a dictionary, because just now I made a mention of the dictionary. A portrait is different from a picture, which is essentially different from a photograph. A portrait talks about the physical, not only just the physical appearance, it is as close as possible, something which could resemble a person. Fine, it can be a pen picture, that is a verbal description of a person, or it can be on another medium, it can be a painting done of a person, right? A picture is something different and a photo is something different, because photo means light and a photograph is made use of is created with the help of camera, right? Coming back to our portrait, he just doesn't just say the old lady, talks about how old the lady was. He also goes on to talk about how he was very amused, even the very thought was very revolting when she talked about how she was young and pretty once upon a time. This is exactly what happens to little children, because they have never seen their parents as young people or grandparents as young people. Grandparents and parents have seen little children, but the children in turn have never seen them as young people. So Kushwant Singh, as a young boy, could never believe that his grandmother was also once upon a time very young and charming, and she also was playing around the place like as he is now doing. And he even makes a remark whenever she talks about her youth, whenever she talks about her childhood, and when she talks about the little pranks she played around, he used to feel very revolted. The very thought was revolting. Now, what do you mean by the thought being revolting? It just means that it was not a happy thought, it was not a pleasant thought, it was not a thought which could be accepted and appreciated. Because he thought a grandmother is born as a grandmother and she could never be young at all. Fine. And he turns around and asks this question. I also understand that she was once married to my grandfather, and there is a photo of the grandfather on the mantelpiece. Fine. And the grandfather looks easily 100 years of age. And he has a long flowing beard which almost covers the maximum part of his chest. And the man doesn't look as if he can have a wife and a family, but he looks as if he is capable of having lots and lots of grandchildren. As you go through the story, as you read through the language, you really feel amused, because it's a beautiful way of presenting one's grandparents to the readers. We are reminded of our own grandparents. Fine. Then he moves on to say, my grandmother could never be pretty. No, she has always been short, she has always been plump with a little lean. She could never walk properly, her gait was so different because she had a bad back, a lean. Fine. She used to hobble around the place. She could never be pretty, but nonetheless she has always been very beautiful. Now is another chance for you to understand being pretty is something totally different from being beautiful. Beautiful doesn't just talk about the physical appearance of a person. It includes the person's inner peace, contentment, qualities and intelligence. Pretty may be something very attractive physically. Fine, even you can say somebody looks very gorgeous. That also limits itself. The word limits itself with the physical appearance of the person. It doesn't include the inner beauty. But here Kushwant Singh talks about his grandmother. He says his grandmother she was never pretty, she could never be pretty. She is always beautiful. And he compares her to a beautiful landscape, and that landscape is covered with snow. Fine, as she moves around the place with a spotlessly beautiful dress, white colored garment, fine, with a little lean, putting one hand to support her back and the other hand carries always a rosary, a string of beads with which she could offer her prayer, keep counting how often she prayed. She looks like a very beautiful landscape with snow-clad mountains, so serene, so beautiful, so content and so peaceful. Now, Kushwant Singh and his grandmother shared a wonderful friendship. Now, how did they become friends? Of course, the grandson and the grandmother will always have a commendable relationship, a very lovable relationship, but he calls it rather friendship and not relationship. Now, why was it a friendship? Fine, his parents moved to the city, and until they could really settle down and find a comfortable place to live, they allowed the little boy to stay with his grandmother. And grandmother took care of every little thing he wanted. All his little wants were taken care of by his grandmother, and early in the morning she would wake up and wake him also up, give him a bath, fine, and all these things she would do chanting her prayer, beautifully singing her prayer. And Kushwant Singh tells us that he loved listening to the beautiful voice of his grandmother, though the grandmother wanted him to learn the prayer by heart, which in future may help him to lead a very good life. Fine, he didn't learn the prayer, but of course he appreciated the lovely voice of his grandmother. So morning she used to give him a bath, take him to school, along with all those things he would need to learn how to read and write. And along with that, she would also provide him with a breakfast. And what kind of a breakfast? Here Kushwant Singh makes use of a word which is certainly not English, which is in the vocabulary of Indian languages. She would feed him with chapatis. And what kind of chapatis? They were not freshly made, they were stale, they were a bit old. But she would make him eat it just by spreading a bit of butter and sprinkling some sugar on it. She would make it palatable for him. After having eaten that breakfast, he will go along with his grandmother to school. Grandmother made it a point to accompany him to school, and while going to school, she will have some more stale chapatis in her hand for reserve, not to give the boy, but these stale chapatis had a very specific use, and you will learn about it as the story progresses. This particular boy was taken to the school. The school was fine. It was very close to a temple. The temple priest on one hand would teach all the children alphabet, and he will also teach them prayer. On the other hand, older people who accompany children will be there seated in the temple reading scriptures until the classes for the children get over. Fine. After the classes get over, the grandmother will collect the little boy, and while walking back, there will be lots and lots of street dogs, and to avoid them, what will this grandmother do? She will just break this stale chapati to pieces and throw it at them so that they will be fighting with each other and they will not bark at these two people. They used to come back home, and this is exactly how life went on for little Kushwant Singh with his grandmother until his parents one day summoned both the grandmother and the little boy to the city, because already they have settled well in the city. Now this happens to be the turning point in the life of this little boy. Though his grandmother and this boy happen to share the same room, emotionally they become more distanced now. The boy has been put in a school of English medium, fine, and when he comes back home, eagerly the grandmother used to ask him what he learnt in school. And the little boy used to talk about the laws of gravity, Archimedes' principle, and every other thing that was taught in school, which the grandmother could never follow or understand. But nonetheless, all these things, the boy could understand that they left her very unhappy, because the boy was not taught what she wanted the child to be taught in school. Like the school way, in the village way, he was taught prayer and other things. Here things were totally different, and the boy, the grandmother could never follow him to school either, because the boy used to go to school by a motor bus, as Kushwant Singh says, and the grandmother could not follow him. But instead, the grandmother, instead of feeding the dogs with chapatis, now has another kind of hobby. She starts having friendship with little sparrows. In the afternoon, she used to feed them with bread crumbs. Fine. Days go by and years roll by, and the little boy has now, from school, has moved to college. He is no longer a little boy, and the distance between the grandmother and the grandson, it keeps widening. They have nothing more to talk at all. And even when he was in school, once the grandmother, she asked him a question when he said that he is learning to sing, and when she wanted him to sing, he sang the songs of Western music, and totally the grandmother was disappointed and she stopped talking with him. Fine. But as a boy now, Kushwant Singh goes to college. The grandmother spends much of her time with her spinning wheel and prayer from dawn to dusk. Maybe the one time throughout the day when she was very happy, that happens to be the afternoon time. After lunch, she used to sit in the courtyard of the house and feed the sparrows. And she loved it. And the sparrows made a huge bedlam. They made such a huge commotion. There was so much of noise. They used to perch on her leg. They used to perch on her head, on her shoulder. But she used to just chide them endearingly, scold them endearingly, never seriously, scold them endearingly. But she enjoyed the whole show. The family could appreciate this, fine. But every time you will find her always in prayer. Maybe the only time she took a break from the prayer, that was the time when she was with the sparrows, feeding them. Again, years roll by. After his college years, Kushwant Singh decides to go abroad to continue with his studies. And that's going to be 5 years. He has to take 5 years off from the family. And the grandmother is, again, she is very old. Any grandmother would have felt extremely sad, because this doesn't give any guarantee that the boy would be back and she would be alive to receive him. But that's not the case with the grandmother of Kushwant Singh. Now she is very sure that she will stay alive to receive Kushwant Singh after his course for 5 years is over, when he comes back from his abroad education, right? So she goes along with him to the railway station, bids him farewell, and even then she keeps her rosary in her hand. Fine, she keeps telling the beads, she keeps on chanting the prayer, but plants a wet kiss on his forehead. And that's what he says. When the train leaves the station, all I could remember of my grandmother was the wet kiss she planted upon my forehead as a blessing before she took part from me. Fine. 5 years roll by, and he comes back, and again to receive him, the grandmother is there at the railway station. And she is as old as she was. She has not grown older than this at all. It looks as if time has come to one huge stop when it comes to aging of the grandmother. She comes back, fine, along with him, and he finds that the grandmother enjoys again feeding the sparrow. But that particular evening, she doesn't pray. She summons all the women of the neighborhood and starts playing on an old drum. He calls it a dilapidated drum with sagging skin. She starts singing, playing the drum, and the family would like to stop her because she may be straining herself too much, which is certainly not good for her frail health, but she wouldn't stop. At one point, they compel her, convince her, somehow persuade her to stop so that she can go take rest. She goes back, and the next day morning, she has already taken unwell with fever. The doctor says it's just mild rise in the temperature and it would go away. She can just take rest, and that's what she should have done. But what happens? She has something entirely different in her mind. When the family asks her to take rest, she says, no, my end is very close by. I'm sure I'm going to die. I have just got few hours left behind. It's so very unfortunate that I did not do my prayer as I used to do my prayer. Fine, there was a break in it. So instead of talking with you all, I would rather start with my prayer. They want her so much to talk with them, but she wouldn't. Fine. She is not an adamant woman, but a very determined woman. A woman who has a will of her own. Now what happens? She goes back, she lies down and starts again telling her beads. As these people keep watching her, they find very gradually her life departs. Even before they could realize that she is dead, everything happens so smoothly, and her face becomes absolutely pale. The fingers stop telling the beads, and the lips, for the first time, they just are tightly closed. Now, as per their custom, they take her body from the cot, from the bed, and put it down, and they cover it with a shroud. Shroud happens to be the piece of cloth with which you cover a dead body, a corpse. Now, they cover it, spend some time there mourning for her departure, and leave the room, leaving her body alone. They leave the room so that they can make preparation for her final journey. The evening they get back to the room, and they were so surprised. Outside the sun sets, the setting sun is outside, and the room gets flooded with the light, the beautiful golden light of setting sun. And what do they see? To their very great surprise, they see hundreds and hundreds of sparrows that have gathered around the body of this dead lady. And none of them, they used to make so much of noise, but today none of them make any noise as such. There's absolute quiet, so much of peace, and these people are very surprised. Even their cook mistakes that the sparrow's visit should be for their regular, that is routine feed of breadcrumbs. So he rushes, brings breadcrumbs and scatters it around, thinking that the birds have come for that and they would just eat and go away. No, the sparrows don't even care to collect, eat the breadcrumbs. They just stay there for a long time. And the next day morning, you find again the servant has to come and sweep away the untouched breadcrumbs and throw them off. The story comes to a very beautiful close. For the first time, you start looking at the grandmother from an entirely different angle. There is something so cosmic about this woman. There is something so universal about this woman. Turn around, you will find almost all these qualities in your grandmother also. The only problem is we never cared. We never cared to observe these qualities, which, of course, Kushwant Singh has beautifully recorded in his The Portrait of a Lady. Your grandmother should also be very old now. Maybe she should be in her middle 60s or late 60s. She too might have developed a lame. Fine. She too might find it extremely difficult to walk steadily as you walk or your parents walk. She too should be. Her gait would be so different, you all even would have laughed at her. But one thing is for certain. After some time, the grandmother, she becomes a kind of an embodiment of power, a power that pervades through everything, a kind of a power which is available in nature. Like nature, she showers her love over everything, not just human beings. It can be bees, it can be plant, it can be birds, it can be anything. The love becomes so big. That's why I said they become cosmic in their love. And towards the end, maybe for the first time, you understand that Kushwant Singh, the grandson, is no longer laughing at his grandmother. He laughed at her telling beads. He laughed at her gait. He laughed at her not being pretty. He laughed at many of those things which always go as characteristic features of a grandmother. But towards the end, you find, no, what was in her was supreme kind of love that you find sparrows who do not talk in human language, who do not understand human relationship, could understand that she will not be any more with them to feed them, laugh with them, scold them, chide them, give them a beautiful company. Just not feeding them with breadcrumbs, something more than that. Maybe feeding them with her love, the unspoken love, the love which is not audible to human ears but is audible to all the other creatures. As the story closes, fine, I did develop a kind of a heavy heart. I was thinking of my grandmother. I was thinking of all the grandmothers whom I come upon in my life, in my neighborhood. People who are ignored, people who are not respected. Why respect people who are not understood properly? Maybe this particular beautiful essay by Kushwant Singh has been prescribed to you with one specific purpose, one specific value. What does your grandmother and grandfather represent? What do they represent? What does she represent? What do these people represent? They represent an age they have lived through. They represent their experience. They represent wisdom. They express the knowledge which they have gathered through their life. They may not or they might not have had your education, but what they learned was from life, more authentic, more original, more dependable, and more responsive and responsible. As the story closes, you have got a long catalogue of reading comprehension questions, because every little essay has to be read silently so that you get the complete meaning. You may come upon certain difficult words, but you can always understand the meaning of the words in the context, though you have to refer to a dictionary to understand the complete meaning of the word in isolation, also in a context. After reading comprehension, you have certain fill in the blanks assignments and such certain master following assignments, so that your comprehension becomes more complete and concrete regarding the lesson, the grammatical items that are being used, and the vocabulary which they want you to improve upon. Then you also have a very beautiful assignment. It talks about homonyms and homophones. And I think homo is single and phone is sound. Homophone happens to be, it refers to words which when you speak, when you utter the words, they sound alike, but their spelling is different and also the meaning is different. For example, when you say break and break, B-R-E-A-K and B-R-A-K-E, when you utter these words, when you pronounce these words, they sound the same, but they are not the same. When you take their spelling is different and meaning is also different. So you have an assignment where you get to know more about homophones. And also the root words are given and you are taught to improve your vocabulary by adding prefixes and suffixes, right? Now I have an assignment for you. You may have your mother tongue as something different. It may not be. If my guess is right, it would not be English. If it is Tamil, fine. You have an assignment now. How about writing a very beautiful article a very beautiful essay as Kushwant Singh has done. His mastery of the language is commendable, is remarkable, it's inimitable. We can't imitate it, but that's something totally different. You should be very sure of your mother tongue. Your vocabulary should be richer in your mother tongue than in English. So what you could do is sit and write a very beautiful essay that would be a fitting reward for the love your grandmother has shown to you or your grandfather has shown to you. Collect information about your grandmother or grandfather from your parents. Sit there, analyze them, assemble them in a very logical order, right? Logical order, I would rather advise or suggest to make it into a chronological order, in the sense that how you started loving your grandmother when you were a little boy, how you were so dependent on her because she used to feed you, she used to play with you, she used to clothe you, she used to give you a bath, she used to do every little thing to see that you are always happy and smiling. But when you went to school, very slowly the distance between you and your grandmother, I'm not talking about the physical distance, I'm talking about the emotional distance. How you moved away from your grandmother or grandfather, and maybe you visited them all during your school holidays. Even that would have come to a stop because you had something else to do during your holidays. You had other assignments, maybe academic assignments or something else to spend your holidays with. As a result of which, seldom you visited your grandparents, and even when they visited you, you had nothing in common to speak with them. Now that's exactly how the emotional umbilical cord gets cut, right? The emotional relationship, it just gets cut and you have nothing to speak with your grandparents. Lucky you are, because you have a mother tongue, and the mother tongue is spoken by your grandmother also. But I have come upon many young men and women who have migrated from their country to another country, to the Western world, and they been born there, they are born and brought up there with English as their mother tongue, and they do not have anything, even the tongue is not common. They don't have one common language with which they could converse with their grandparents. They are totally distanced. I think you are not that unfortunate. You are very fortunate. Sit and write a beautiful essay about your grandparents, or if you have a bit of poet in you, why not you sit and compose a beautiful poem about them, bringing all the attributes, creating a pen portrait of them, adding all lovely colors through words so that you can display their emotion, their appearance, and nonetheless give them a kind of a tribute which they would really appreciate. Fine? We will meet in the next class with the next assignment. Good evening. Thank you.